In a small California suburb, a single father's worst nightmare is about to become the most beautiful surprise of his life. Dan Morales works with his hands, lives paycheck to paycheck, and does everything he can to give his 9-year-old son a good life. But Mateo sees something his father doesn't: how lonely Dan really is. At a community fair, the boy spots an elegant woman sitting alone and marches right up to her with a simple request: "Will you marry my dad?" Dan wants to disappear into the ground, apologizing frantically before hurrying away. What he doesn't know is that the woman Mateo approached isn't just anyone. She's Lila Tran, a billionaire who built an empire and chose this quiet town to escape her complicated world. But sometimes the most innocent questions can change everything. What happens when a child's pure heart sees exactly what two guarded adults need most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn quiet of the small apartment at exactly 5:30, same as it had every weekday morning for the past 3 years. Dan Morales reached across the narrow bed and silenced it with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to wake without disturbing his son in the next room. The numbers on the digital display glowed in unforgiving green in the darkness. Another day, another dollar, another step in the careful dance of making ends meet. He padded quietly to the kitchenette, his bare feet familiar with every creaking floorboard that might wake Matteo. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling their modest 2-bedroom apartment with the rich aroma that had become his morning meditation. While it brewed, Dan stepped onto the small balcony overlooking the courtyard of Sunrise Gardens, apartment complex that had seen better decades, but housed good people who looked out for each other. The leather tool belt hung on its designated hook by the front door, worn smooth by years of honest work. Dan ran his fingers along its familiar contours, the hammer loop stretched from use, the tape measure clip polished by countless attachments and removals, the small tears patched with electrical tape. This belt had been with him through his marriage, through the divorce, through the lean months when Matteo was sick and work was scarce. It represented everything he was: dependable, practical, unashamed of working with his hands. "Morning, Dad." Matteo's sleepy voice drifted from the hallway. The boy appeared in dinosaur pajamas, his dark hair sticking up at impossible angles, brown eyes still heavy with sleep, but brightening at the sight of his father. "Morning, Mio." Dan poured orange juice into Matteo's favorite chipped ceramic mug, decorated with a faded baseball logo. "Sleep good?" "I dreamed about that dog again. The golden one from Mrs. Chun's apartment." Matteo climbed onto the kitchen stool, his legs swinging freely. "Do you think we could get a dog someday?" Dan's chest tightened slightly. Someday, the word that held all the promises he wanted to make, but couldn't quite afford yet. "Maybe when we move to a place with a yard, buddy. Dogs need space to run. Mrs. Rodriguez says her nephew has puppies. Free to good homes." Matteo's voice carried that careful hope children use when they know the answer, but can't help asking. "Anyway, we'll see." Dan ruffled his son's hair, that universal parent phrase that meant, "I wish I could give you everything." He placed a bowl of cereal in front of Matteo and watched him eat, marveling as always at this person he'd helped create. 9 years old, and already showing signs of the man he'd become: thoughtful, observant, possessed of an empathy that sometimes worried Dan. The world could be hard on people who felt too much. "Dad?" Matteo looked up from his cereal. "How come? You don't have a girlfriend?" The question caught Dan mid-sip of coffee. He set down his mug carefully, buying time. These conversations had become more frequent lately, usually triggered by something at school, a friend's parent getting remarried, a Disney movie, or simply Matteo's growing awareness that their family of 2 was different from most. "I'm pretty busy with work and taking care of you," Dan said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he'd tried dating a few times since the divorce, but it never seemed to work. Either the women wanted something casual that felt wrong when he had a son to consider, or they wanted something serious that felt too much like risking the stability he'd fought so hard to build. But don't you get lonely? Mateo's question held no judgment, only genuine concern. Sometimes when you think I'm asleep, I hear you watching TV by yourself. And you always look sad when other dads at school have wives with them. Dan felt his throat tighten. How did children see so much? I have you, buddy. That's all I need. But what about when I grow up and move away? You'll be all alone. The worry in Mateo's voice was real and adult, too heavy for 9-year-old shoulders. That's a long time away, Dan said gently. And I'll be fine. Grown-ups are good at taking care of themselves. Mateo nodded, but Dan could see he wasn't entirely convinced. The boy had inherited his father's protective instincts, and Dan sometimes wondered if he worried too much about his old man's happiness. It was supposed to be the other way around. They fell into their morning routine, Dan packing his lunch while Mateo finished breakfast, and the careful coordination of getting ready for school and work. Dan had perfected the art of preparing Mateo's backpack while simultaneously locating his own work clothes, all while monitoring the clock to ensure they stayed on schedule. There was a rhythm to it, a comfortable dance they'd choreographed through necessity and repetition. Mr. Garcia is picking me up after school for soccer practice, Mateo announced, shouldering his backpack. His mom said she'd bring me home by 6. Tell Mrs. Garcia thank you from me. Don knelt to Mateo's level, straightening his shirt collar. And remember, mind my manners, do my best, and don't be afraid to ask for help, Mateo recited with a grin. It was their daily parting ritual, Dan's way of sending his boy into the world armed with the values that mattered most. The walk to Roosevelt Elementary took 12 minutes at Mateo's pace, and Dan treasured every one of them. These were the moments when his son's thoughts spilled out freely, observations about cloud shapes, questions about why street lights stayed on during the day, stories about classmates and teachers. Dan had learned to be fully present for these walks, storing away each random comment and innocent question like treasures. There's going to be a community fair next weekend, Mateo mentioned as they turned onto Maple Street. At the school. Can we go? We'll see how the weekend shapes up, Dan replied automatically, then caught himself. You know what? Yes, we should go. Might be fun. Mateo's face lit up. Really? Mrs. Patterson says there's going to be games and food trucks and everything. Tommy's dad is running the ring toss booth. Sounds like the whole neighborhood will be there. Don smiled at his son's excitement. Community events weren't usually his preference. He felt awkward making small talk with other parents, aware of the subtle differences in their circumstances. But Mateo loved being around people, and Dan had learned that his own discomfort was a small price to pay for his son's happiness. At the school gate, Don watched Mateo join the stream of children flowing toward the building. His son moved easily among his classmates, calling out greetings, falling into step with friends. It was a relief to see. Some children of divorce became withdrawn or anxious, but Mateo seemed to have inherited his father's resilience, along with his mother's social grace. The drive to the job site took Dan through neighborhoods that told the story of their small cities' changing fortunes. Past the new developments with their pristine lawns and 3-car garages, through the older middle-class sections where he did most of his work, and finally to the commercial district where today's project waited. He was installing new fixtures. In a medical office, detail work that required patience and precision. Exactly the kind of job that had built his reputation as someone you could trust to do things right. Dr. Patel greeted him warmly. Don, right on time as always. How's that boy of yours? Growing like a weed. Made honor roll again last quarter. Dan couldn't keep the pride from his voice. Whatever else he might lack as a provider, he was raising a good kid. You should be proud. Education is everything in this world. Dr. Patel showed him to the room where the work needed to be done. Take your time, do it right. That's why I always call you. The work absorbed Dan completely, the familiar weight of tools in his hands, the satisfaction of solving small problems and creating something better than what had been there before. His phone buzzed occasionally with texts from other clients, and he made mental notes about scheduling. Work had been steady lately, a blessing he never took for granted. 3 years ago, when the divorce was finalized and he was starting over, there had been months when he wasn't sure how he'd keep the lights on. Now he could usually manage the bills with a little left over, enough for Mateo's school activities and the occasional movie night. During his lunch break, Don sat in his truck and called his sister Maria. "How are my 2 favorite men?" she asked, without preamble. "Getting by. Mateo wants to know when you're coming to visit." "Soon. Miguel's been asking about his cousin, too. Maybe we can drive down next month." Maria paused. "You sound tired, hermano." "Just working. You know how it is." "I know you work too hard and never do anything for yourself." "When's the last time you went on a date?" Anne sighed. "Not you too. Mateo asked me the same thing this morning. Smart kid. Takes after his Tia." Maria's voice softened. "Danny, you know I love you, but you can't live your whole life just for work and Mateo. You deserve to be happy too." "I am happy." "Are you? Really?" The question lingered after they hung up. Was he happy? Or was he just managing? There was a difference, he supposed, though he wasn't sure he had the luxury of examining it too closely. Happiness felt like something for people who had their lives figured out, who didn't lie awake at night, calculating whether the truck would make it through another month, or whether Mateo's shoes would last until the next paycheck. The afternoon flew by in a blur of precise measurements and careful installation. By 5 o'clock, Dan was putting away his tools, satisfied with another job, completed to his exacting standards. Dr. Patel inspected the work and nodded approvingly. "Beautiful work, as always. I'll be sure to recommend you to my colleagues." "I appreciate that, Doc." Dan packed his tool belt carefully, each implement in its proper place. "You've got my number if anything needs adjusting." The drive home took him past the elementary school, now empty except for the janitor's truck in the parking lot. In a few hours, he'd pick up Mateo from soccer practice, and they'd have dinner together, probably grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, Mateo's favorite. Then homework at the kitchen table while Dan reviewed invoices and planned tomorrow's work. Bath time, a bedtime story, and then the quiet hours when Dan would sit alone in the living room, sometimes reading, sometimes just thinking it was a good life. He reminded himself. Simple, honest, built on love and hard work. If it was also sometimes lonely, well, that was a small price to pay for the privilege of raising a son like Mateo. The boy was everything, his reason for getting up each morning, his motivation to keep pushing forward, his greatest source of pride and joy. The community fair next weekend would be good for both of them, Dan decided. Mateo would love the games and excitement, and Dan could handle a few hours of neighborly small talk if it made his son happy. Besides, it had been too long since they'd done something purely for fun. He had no way of knowing that a simple community fair would change everything, that his son's innocent heart was about to set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything Dan thought he knew about love, pride, and what it meant to let someone into your carefully constructed life. Saturday morning arrived with the promise of perfect, weather-clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming jasmine from Mrs. Rodriguez's garden. Dan had hoped for rain, something that might give them an excuse to skip the community fair, but Mateo had been bouncing around the apartment since dawn, too excited to contain himself. "Come on, Dad, we're going to be late." Mateo tugged at Dan's hand as they approached Roosevelt Elementary's parking lot, which had been transformed into a bustling fairground. Colorful banners fluttered between hastily erected booths, and the air buzzed with children's laughter and the cheerful chaos of a neighborhood coming together. Dan surveyed the scene with a mixture of resignation and affection that had become his default response to Mateo's enthusiasms. Ring toss games, face-painting stations, a small petting zoo in the corner where someone's goats were drawing delighted squeals from toddlers. The PTA had outdone themselves, creating exactly the kind of wholesome community event that made Dan feel both grateful for their neighborhood and acutely aware of his position as an observer rather than a participant. "Look, there's Mrs. Patterson." Mateo waved enthusiastically at his third-grade teacher, who was manning the bake sale table with the fierce efficiency of someone who'd volunteered for every school event since the Carter administration. "And there's Tommy and his dad at the ring toss." Don nodded and smiled, letting Mateo's excitement wash over him. This was what mattered his son's joy, the simple pleasure of being part of something larger than their small apartment and careful routines. He could endure a few hours of awkward small talk with other parents if it meant seeing Mateo this happy. They made their way through the crowd, Dan keeping one eye on his son and another on his wallet. $5 for game tickets, $3 for a snow cone, $2 for the ring toss. It added up quickly, but Mateo's delight was worth every carefully counted bill. "Dad, look at that lady over there." Mateo pointed toward a quieter section of the fair, near the edge of the parking lot. "She looks sad." Dan followed his son's gaze and saw a woman sitting alone on a folding chair beside an information booth that appeared to be unmanned. She was perhaps in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and an elegant bearing that seemed at odds with the casual chaos around her. She wore a crisp white blouse and well-fitted jeans that probably cost more than Dan's monthly grocery budget, though he couldn't have explained how he knew that. "Maybe she's just taking a break, buddy. Come on, let's go try the basketball game." But Mateo had inherited his father's protective instincts along with something else, an intuitive sense about people that sometimes worried Dan with its accuracy. The boy studied the woman for a long moment, his expression serious. "She doesn't just look sad, Dad. She looks lonely. Like when you sit by yourself after you think I'm asleep." The observation hit Dan harder than it should have. "Mateo, I'm gonna go talk to her." "No, Mio, we shouldn't bother." But Mateo was already walking toward the woman with the confident stride of a child who'd never met a stranger he couldn't befriend. Dan hurried after him, his stomach churning with the familiar anxiety of social situations beyond his control. "Excuse me," Mateo said politely, stopping in front of the woman's chair. "Are you okay? You look like you might be lonely." The woman looked up, and Dan caught his first clear view of her face. She was beautiful in a way that suggested good bones and expensive skincare, but her eyes held a sadness that Mateo had accurately identified. When she smiled at his son, however, her entire face transformed. "Hello there," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Dan couldn't place. "That's very thoughtful of you to ask." "I'm fine. Just enjoying watching everyone have fun." "Are you here by yourself?" Mateo's directness made Dan wince internally. "I am," she replied, without seeming offended by the question. "That's no good." Mateo's face brightened, as if he just solved a complex puzzle. "You should have someone to enjoy the fair with." "My dad doesn't have anyone either. I mean, he has me, but not like a grown-up someone." He turned toward Dan with devastating innocent enthusiasm. "Dad, this is ... He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. "Lila," the woman supplied, standing gracefully. She was taller than Dan had expected, and when she extended her hand toward him, he noticed her nails were perfectly manicured. Without being flashy, Dan Morales he managed, shaking her hand and feeling foolish. "I'm sorry about my son. He's very ... social. Don't apologize. It's refreshing." Leela's eyes crinkled with genuine amusement. Most adults have forgotten how to be so direct about what they observe. Matteo beamed at what he clearly interpreted as encouragement. "My dad works really hard, and he's super nice, and he makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in the whole world. He doesn't have a girlfriend because he's too busy taking care of me, but I think he gets lonely sometimes." Matteo. Dan's face burned with embarrassment. "We should let this nice lady get back to. And he's really handsome too," Matteo continued, with the unstoppable momentum of a child on a mission. "Mrs. Rodriguez says he's a catch, whatever that means." Leela's laugh was musical and completely unforced. "Mrs. Rodriguez sounds very wise." Dan wanted to disappear into the asphalt. "I'm really sorry. He's 9, and he doesn't understand? Will you marry my dad?" The words hung in the air like a cartoon anvil about to drop. Dan felt the blood drain from his face as nearby parents turned to stare. A mother pushing a stroller slowed her pace to listen. Tommy's father at the ring toss booth glanced over with poorly concealed amusement. "Matteo." Dan's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "You cannot just ask people." "Why not?" Matteo looked genuinely confused. "She's pretty, and she seems nice, and you need someone to take care of you when I grow up. It makes perfect sense." Lila had gone very still, but Dan could see she was fighting back laughter rather than offense. Her eyes met his over Matteo's head, and for a moment they shared the universal experience of adults caught in the undertow of childhood logic. "That's a very sweet offer," Lila said to Matteo with complete seriousness. "Your father is obviously a wonderful man if he raised such a thoughtful son. So is that a yes?" Matteo's face lit up with hope. "I think," Lila said carefully, "that these things usually work a bit differently. People need time to get to know each other first." And finally found his voice. "I am so incredibly sorry. He doesn't understand, ... I mean, we should go." "Right. Now, come on, Matteo." He grabbed his son's hand, mumbling apologies as he tried to retreat, but Matteo planted his feet with surprising determination. "Wait, Dad. We can't just leave. That's rude." He looked up at Lila with earnest concern. "Would you like to walk around the fair with us? That way you won't be lonely, and my dad won't be embarrassed anymore." "Matteo, we can't impose." "I'd love to," Lila said quietly. Dan stared at her. "You ... what?" "I'd love to walk around with you both, if that's all right with you, of course." Her expression was gentle but amused. "It's been a long time since anyone invited me to enjoy a community fair." Dan's mind raced through a dozen reasons to politely decline, but Matteo was already bouncing with excitement, and Lila was looking at him with patient kindness. The situation had spiraled so far beyond his comfort zone that he felt oddly detached from his own embarrassment. Okay, sure, but I want you to know that this isn't. I mean, I didn't plan ... double quotes. Of course not." Leela's tone was reassuring. Sometimes the best things happen without planning. They spent the next 2 hours touring the fair together, and Dan had to admit it was more enjoyable than he'd expected. Lila showed genuine interest in everything the student art displays, the various fundraising booths, even the slightly wilted bake sale offerings. She asked thoughtful questions about the school and the neighborhood, listening to Dan's answers with the kind of attention that made him forget his initial embarrassment. More surprisingly, she was wonderful with Matteo. She didn't talk down to him or dismiss his enthusiasms. When he explained the complex rules of the game he'd invented for the ring toss, she listened as if he were presenting a doctoral thesis. When he won a small stuffed dinosaur at the basketball game, she celebrated, as if he'd won an Olympic medal. "You're really good with kids," Dan observed as they watched Matteo pet a goat with intense concentration. "I don't have much practice," Lila replied. But children are honest in a way that's refreshing. There was something wistful in her tone that made Dan study her profile. She was clearly well-educated, probably successful given her clothes and bearing. But there was a loneliness around her that Matteo had recognized immediately. "Are you from around here?" he asked. "I just moved to the area, still getting my bearings." She smiled at him. "This is exactly what I needed, a chance to see the real neighborhood, meet real people." Dan felt a flush of pride at being considered real people, though he wasn't sure why her approval mattered to him. When Matteo ran off to get his face painted, Dan found himself alone with Lila for the first time. The silence should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. "Your son is remarkable," she said. "He's everything to me." The words came out more intensely than Dan had intended. "It shows. He's confident and kind. That doesn't happen by accident." Dan felt that familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone recognized his efforts as a father. "I try. It's not always easy, doing it alone." "I imagine not." Lila's voice was soft. "His mother? She left 3 years ago." Decided. Motherhood wasn't what she'd expected. Dan surprised himself by offering the information so readily. "I'm sorry." That must have been devastating. For him, yes. For me. Dan paused, realizing he'd never articulated this thought before. Honestly, it clarified things, showed me what really mattered. When Matteo returned with elaborate tiger face painted on his cheeks, he was practically vibrating with excitement and sugar from the snow cone he'd convinced some sympathetic parent to buy him. "This is the best day ever," he announced. "Lila, you should come to our apartment for dinner tomorrow. Dad makes really good spaghetti, and we could watch a movie. Matteo... Dan started. "That sounds lovely," Lila said, "but I wouldn't want to impose on your family time." "You wouldn't be imposing." Matteo's voice carried the absolute certainty of childhood. "Right, Dad?" "Tell her she wouldn't be imposing." Dan looked at Lila, expecting to see polite discomfort, but instead found genuine interest in her expression. "You really don't have to. I'd like to," she said simply. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble." And that was how Don found himself agreeing to cook dinner for a woman whose last name he didn't even know, whose appearance in their lives had been as unexpected as it was disruptive. As they exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans, he couldn't shake the feeling that Matteo had set something in motion that went far beyond a simple dinner invitation. Walking home, Matteo chattered excitedly about their new friend, but Dan found himself unusually quiet. Something about Lila puzzled him. The expensive clothes paired with genuine warmth. The way she'd seemed both surprised and delighted by their simple community fare. The careful way she'd answered questions about herself. But what puzzled him most was his own reaction to her. It had been years since he'd felt that particular flutter of interest, that awareness of a woman as more than just another parent or neighbor. It was both thrilling and terrifying, a reminder of feelings he'd carefully packed away after his divorce. Later, that evening, after Matteo had fallen asleep still talking about the fair, Dan sat in his quiet living room and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Tomorrow, he'd be cooking dinner for a woman his son had essentially proposed to on his behalf. It was either the beginning of something wonderful or a disaster waiting to happen. He just couldn't decide which. Sunday morning brought with it a peculiar mixture of anticipation and dread that Dan hadn't experienced since his first day at a new job. He'd woken up 3 times during the night, his mind cycling through everything they could go wrong with. The evening ahead, what if Lila had second thoughts? What if Matteo said something even more mortifying than yesterday? What if the spaghetti sauce turned out terrible? "Dad, you're making pancakes wrong," Matteo observed from his perch at the kitchen counter. "You usually flip them when they bubble, but that one's getting all burnt." Don looked down at the skillet, where indeed a pancake was turning an unfortunate shade of brown. "Sorry, buddy." Guess I'm distracted. Because Lila's coming over? Mateo's grin was pure mischief. Are you nervous? Mrs. Rodriguez says men always get nervous when they like a lady. Mrs. Rodriguez has a lot of opinions about my personal life, Dan muttered, successfully flipping the next pancake. And I'm not nervous. I'm just making sure we're good hosts. You, Mateo didn't sound convinced. Can I show her my dinosaur book? And my rock collection? Oh, and the picture I drew of our family? Don paused in his pancake flipping. What? Picture? The one from art class last week? We had to draw our families. Mateo's voice carried that careful casualness that meant he was about to say something significant. I drew you and me, and then I drew a lady next to you because Mrs. Patterson said families can look lots of different ways. Mateo ... I know. I drew it before I met Lila, so it's just a regular lady with brown hair. But maybe I could add some details to make it look more like her? The earnestness in his son's voice made Dan's chest tight. He set down the spatula and turned to face Mateo fully. Buddy, you know that just because we had a nice time yesterday doesn't mean Lila's going to become part of our family, right? Why not? Mateo's question held genuine confusion. She liked us, and we liked her, and she's coming to dinner. Isn't that how it starts? Dan struggled for words that would temper his son's expectations without crushing his natural optimism. Sometimes people are just friends, Mio. Good friends who enjoy spending time together but don't become a family. But she could, right? If everyone wanted to? I suppose, but then why wouldn't she want to? We're pretty great. Mateo's confidence was absolute and heartbreaking. Dan finished the pancakes in thoughtful silence, wondering how to protect his son from disappointment while still allowing room for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, something good might come from yesterday's unexpected encounter. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Dan cleaned the apartment twice, rearranged the living room furniture, and made 3 trips to the grocery store as he second-guessed his menu choices. Finally, in desperation, he called his sister. You're overthinking this, Maria said without preamble after he'd explained the situation. It's dinner, not a marriage proposal. Mateo basically already made the marriage proposal, Dan replied, pacing the small living room. Maria, what am I doing? I don't know anything about this woman, except that she was kind to my son, and she has expensive taste in clothes. So find out more about her. That's what dinner conversations are for. Maria's voice softened. Danny, when's the last time you were excited about something that wasn't directly related to Mateo's happiness? The question stopped Dan mid-pace. That's not? I mean, I get excited about things. Like what? Dan searched his mind for examples and came up empty. Work going well. Bills getting paid on time. Mateo's report cards. All Mateo related or survival related. I'm talking about something just for you. Mateo is enough for me. Mateo is wonderful, but he's not supposed to be your whole world forever. He's going to grow up and have his own life, and you'll still be young enough to have a life of your own. Maria paused. Maybe this woman is exactly what you both need. Or maybe she's just being polite and will never call again after tonight. Only one way to find out. At 5 o'clock, Dan was putting the finishing touches on the sauce when his phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Hi, it's Lila. Is there anything I can bring tonight? Looking forward to seeing you both. He stared at the message for a full minute before showing it to Mateo, who was setting the table with the care usually reserved for state dinners. See? She's excited too. Mateo beamed. What should we tell her to bring? Nothing. We're the hosts. Dan typed back. Just yourself. Dinner at 6:30. Her response was immediate. Perfect. See you soon. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30, and Mateo raced to answer it before Dan could stop him. Through the thin walls, Dan heard his son's enthusiastic greeting, followed by Lila's warm laugh. "Dad, Leela's here," and she brought flowers. Dan emerged from the kitchen to find Lila standing in their small entryway, looking around with genuine interest rather than the polite assessment he'd half expected. She'd changed from yesterday's casual elegance into a simple blue dress that somehow managed to look both appropriate for their modest apartment and more expensive than Dan's monthly rent. "These are beautiful," Dan said, accepting the bouquet of mixed wildflowers. "You really didn't need to." "I wanted to." Her smile was warm and direct. "Something smells amazing." "Dad makes the best sauce," Matteo announced. "It's his secret recipe. It's from a jar with some extra garlic," Dan corrected, feeling his face warm. "Nothing fancy." "The best recipes often aren't," Lila replied, following them into the kitchen area. "My grandmother always said that food made with care tastes better than food made with expensive ingredients." Dinner exceeded Dan's cautious expectations. Lila proved to be an excellent conversationalist, asking thoughtful questions about their neighborhood, Mateo's school, Dan's work. She listened with genuine attention when Matteo explained his current obsession with paleontology, and nodded seriously when he showed her his carefully organized rock collection. "This one's my favorite," Matteo said, holding up a piece of smooth quartz. "I found it at the beach when me and Dad went camping last summer. It's beautiful. I can see why you treasure it." Lila examined the rock with the respect due a precious gem. "Do you know what kind of quartz this is?" "Just regular quartz, I think." But it was right there on the sand, like it was waiting for me to find it. "Sometimes the best discoveries are the ones that find us," Lila said softly, and Dan caught her glancing at him as she spoke. After dinner, they moved to the living room for the promised movie Mateo's choice, which meant animated dinosaurs and enough educational content to justify the entertainment. Dan settled onto the couch with his usual evening coffee, while Lila accepted his offer of tea, and Matteo claimed the floor with his coloring book. "This is nice," Lila said quietly during a lull in the movie's action. "Peaceful." "Not very exciting," Dan replied. "I imagine you're used to more sophisticated entertainment." "You'd be surprised." Her tone was carefully neutral. "I've had my fill of sophisticated entertainment. This is exactly what I needed." They watched the rest of the movie in comfortable quiet, broken only by Mateo's occasional commentary on the scientific accuracy of the dinosaur portrayals. When the credits rolled, Dan realized with surprise that it was already past 9 o'clock. "I should go," Lila said, though she made no immediate move to leave. "It's a school night." "Do you have two?" Matteo looked up from his coloring. "We could watch another movie, or I could show you more of my rock collection. Or, Matteo, let Lila get home. She's had a long day." Dan stood, but Lila remained seated, looking at something on the coffee table. "Is this the family picture you mentioned?" she asked, picking up Mateo's drawing. Dan's heart sank as he saw which drawing she'd found. It was exactly as Matteo had described stick figures of Dan and Matteo, and next to them a carefully drawn woman with brown hair and a blue dress. At the bottom, in Mateo's neat printing, it said "My Family," with a red heart drawn around all three figures. "I drew that before I met you," Matteo said matter-of-factly. "But I was thinking maybe I could change the hair color to match yours. What do you think?" Dan wanted to disappear through the floor, but Lila was studying the drawing with complete seriousness. "I think," she said finally, "that this is a beautiful picture of your family. And I'm honored that you'd even consider including me in it. Does that mean you'll keep coming to dinner?" Mateo's hope was so naked that Dan ached for him. "If your father doesn't mind, I'd love to spend more time with both of you." Dan managed to nod, though his throat felt tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. At the door, Lila paused. "Thank you for tonight. For both of you. It's been too long since I've felt this welcome anywhere." "Thank you for being so kind to Mateo," Dan replied. "He's not used to having many adults pay attention to his interests. His interests are fascinating. He's a remarkable boy." She looked directly at Dan. "You've done an incredible job raising him." The sincerity in her voice made Dan's chest tight. "I try." "It shows." She hesitated for a moment. "Dan, I hope you don't mind me asking, but would it be all right if I took Mateo to the Natural History Museum next weekend? They have a new dinosaur exhibit, and I think he'd love it." Dan's automatic impulse was to decline. They barely knew each other, and he didn't accept charity. But something in Lila's expression stopped him. This wasn't pity or condescension. This was genuine interest in his son's happiness. "He'd love that," Dan heard himself say, "but let me pay for the tickets. Please, let me do this. It would make me happy to share something with him." After she left, Dan found Mateo in his bedroom, carefully placing his family drawing on his knitstand where he could see it from. His pillow. "Dad?" Mateo's voice was sleepy but satisfied. "I think tonight went really well." "Yeah, buddy. I think it did too." "Do you like her?" "Really like her, I mean." Dan sat on the edge of Mateo's bed, considering the question seriously. "Yeah, Mio, I really like her." "Good, because I think she really likes us too." Mateo yawned hugely. "And Dad?" "I think she's been lonely for a long time. Maybe even longer." "Than you." As Dan tucked his son in and turned off the light, he found himself wondering how a 9-year-old could be so perceptive about things that adults spent years failing to understand. But more than that, he wondered what it meant that a woman like Lila, sophisticated, obviously successful, beautiful, would choose to spend her evening in their modest apartment, genuinely enjoying herself. Later, lying in his own bed and staring at the ceiling, Dan allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Mateo's innocent heart had seen something that his guarded adult mind had missed. Maybe some connections were meant to happen, no matter how unlikely they seemed on the surface. For the first time in 3 years, Dan fell asleep thinking about something other than tomorrow's work schedule or next month's bills. He fell asleep thinking about the way Lila had looked at Mateo's drawing, and the way her laugh had filled their small apartment with warmth, and the possibility that their family of 2 might not have to stay that way forever. Tuesday afternoon found Dan elbow-deep in a plumbing disaster that was the Martinez family's guest bathroom, wrestling with pipes that seemed to have been installed by someone with a grudge against basic geometry. His phone had been buzzing, intermittently with texts from Mateo, photos of his science project, reminders about soccer practice, and at least 3 variations of "When is Lila coming over again?" He was contemplating the creative use of a wrench when he heard familiar voices from the front of the house. Through the open bathroom door, he could see Maria Martinez directing someone toward the kitchen, her voice carrying the particular excitement she reserved for unexpected visitors bearing food. "Dang, you've got company." Dan frowned, wiping his hands on a towel as he made his way toward the front of the house. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his appearance was decidedly unprofessional work clothes, stained with pipe grease, hair disheveled. From crawling around in cramped spaces, the sight that greeted him in the Martinez kitchen stopped him short. Lila stood beside the granite island, elegant and completely out of place, surrounded by enough takeout containers to feed a small army. She'd changed from the sophisticated dresses he'd seen her in before into jeans and a simple sweater, but somehow she still managed to look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Surprise! She smiled, but Dan caught a hint of uncertainty in her expression. "I hope you don't mind me showing up at your work. Mateo mentioned you were working on the Martinez house today, and I thought—" She gestured at the food. "I thought maybe you and the crew might be hungry." Dan became acutely aware of his appearance, and the fact that Maria Martinez was watching this interaction with barely concealed delight. This is—" "You didn't need to ... Is this the famous Lila?" Maria stepped forward with the warm authority of someone who'd never met a stranger. I'm Maria, not Dan's sister, the other Maria. I've heard so much about you from little Matteo. All good things, I hope, Lila replied, accepting Maria's enthusiastic handshake. That boy thinks you hung the moon, Maria laughed. And from what I can see, he's not wrong. Look at all this food. You're an angel. Dan watched in growing mortification as Maria began unpacking containers, revealing an impressive spread from what appeared to be the most expensive Mediterranean restaurant in the city. Grilled lamb, hummus that probably cost more than Dan's lunch budget for a week, artisanal bread that looked like it belonged in a food magazine. This is too much, Dan managed. Really, you can't just... It's just lunch, Lila said quickly. I was ordering for myself anyway, and I thought it might be nice to share. The lie was so transparent that Dan almost smiled despite his discomfort. No one ordered enough food for 8 people for themselves, and certainly not from a restaurant. That required reservations. But before he could protest further, Miguel Martinez and his son appeared from the garage, drawn by the commotion. What's all this? Miguel asked, then caught sight of Lila and immediately straightened his shoulders. Oh, hello there. Introductions were made, and within minutes, Lila had somehow managed to organize an impromptu lunch break for the entire crew. Don found himself seated at the Martinez's dining table, still in his work clothes, watching his colleagues chat easily with a woman who was clearly accustomed to much more refined company. So you're the one who's captured our Dan's attention, said Carlos, Miguel's cousin, with the directness of someone who'd known Dan for years. Mateo hasn't stopped talking about you. He's a special boy, Lila replied. You're all lucky too. Know him? Dan's done a hell of a job raising that kid, Miguel added. Single parenting isn't easy, but you'd never know it watching those two together. Dan shifted uncomfortably as the conversation continued around him. He appreciated his friend's support, but having his personal life discussed over expensive Mediterranean food while he sat covered in pipe grease felt surreal. Dan tells me you're new to the area, Maria said. What brought you to our little corner of the world? I needed a change, Lila answered, and Dan noticed she deflected the question without really answering it. Sometimes you have to step away from your old life to figure out what you really want. Well, you picked a good neighborhood, Carlos said. Good people here, especially this guy. He clapped Dan on the shoulder with enough force to rattle his teeth. Best handyman in the county, and that's not just friend talking. That's professional opinion. Dan felt his face warm. Carlos, I'm serious. This man redid my entire kitchen last year. Turned a disaster into something my wife actually wants to cook in. That's miracle work. He's being too modest, Miguel added. Dan could have his own contracting business if he wanted. Half the neighborhood has his number on speed dial. Lila turned to Dan with interest. You've thought about starting your own business? It's not that simple, Dan deflected. Too much risk. Too much capital needed up front. But you have the skills and the reputation, Lila pressed gently. Those are the hardest parts. Skills and reputation don't pay for business licenses and equipment loans, Dan replied, more sharply than he'd intended. But an awkward silence fell over the table, and Dan immediately regretted his tone. Lila's expression didn't change, but he caught a flicker of something hurt, embarrassment. Before, she smiled and changed the subject. The rest of lunch passed pleasantly enough, but Dan couldn't shake his discomfort. When Lila began packing up the remaining food, insisting they keep it for later, he walked her out to her car. Thank you for lunch, he said stiffly. It was very generous. You're angry with me? It wasn't a question. Dan rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture Matteo had inherited. I'm not angry. I just ... I don't understand why you're doing this. Doing what? This. He gestured helplessly. Expensive lunches, offers to take Matteo to museums, showing up at my work. I don't understand what you want from us." Lila was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was soft but direct. "I want to spend time with you both." "Is that so hard to believe?" "Yes," Dan said honestly. "It is. You're obviously successful, sophisticated. You could have lunch with anyone you want. Why slum it with a handyman and his kid?" The word slum hung in the air between them, and Dan immediately wished he could take it back. Layla's expression hardened slightly. "Is that really what you think I'm doing?" "I don't know what to think. I don't know anything about you, except that you can afford to buy lunch for 5 people at a restaurant I couldn't afford to walk into, and that bothers you. It makes me wonder what this is really about." Lila leaned against her car, a modest sedan that Dan now realized was probably worth more than his annual income, despite its understated appearance. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "I've spent most of my adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My time, my connections, my resources. When I moved here, I told myself I was going to be more careful about who I let into my life." Dan felt a flush of shame. "Lila, then your son asked me to marry his father in the middle of a community fair, and you were so mortified that you could barely speak. And later, when I came to dinner, you both made me feel more welcome in 2 hours than I'd felt anywhere in months. You treated me like a person, not a ... not a resource." "I'm sorry," Dan said quietly. "I didn't mean to imply you're protective of your son and suspicious of people's motives. Those are good qualities." Lila's smile was sad but understanding. "But Don, I'm not here because I pity you or because I'm looking for some kind of charity project. I'm here because I like you, both of you. Because you make me laugh, and Matteo makes me remember what it's like to see the world with wonder." Don felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "I'm not good at this." "At what?" "Letting people help. Trusting that someone might actually want to be around us without having an agenda. Your ex-wife really did a number on you, didn't she?" The observation was gentle, but accurate. Ben nodded, not trusting his voice. "For what it's worth," Lila continued, "I'm not good at this either. At being genuine with people, at letting them see who I really am. We're both learning." That evening, Dan picked up Matteo from soccer practice with his mind still churning over the afternoon's conversation. His son bounded into the truck with his usual post-practice energy, cleats muddy and hair sticking up at odd angles. "Coach Martinez said you had lunch with Lila today." Matteo's eyes were bright with excitement. "Did you invite her? Are you guys becoming boyfriend and girlfriend now?" "Slow down, buddy." Don pulled out of the parking lot, grateful for the excuse to focus on driving. She brought lunch for everyone at the job site. "It was just a nice gesture, but did you like it?" "Did she like meeting your friends?" Dan thought about Miguel and Carlos's easy acceptance of Lila, the way she'd listened with genuine interest to their stories about neighborhood characters and local politics. "Yeah, I think she did." "Good. Mrs. Rodriguez says when a lady brings food to a man's work, it means she's serious about him." "Mrs. Rodriguez needs to mind her own business," Dan muttered, but he was smiling. "She also says you need to bring Lila flowers next time you see her, to show you're serious too." "Does Mrs. Rodriguez have an opinion about everything I do?" "Pretty much. She's very invested in your love life." Matteo said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting the weather. "So are you going to bring her flowers?" Dan considered the question seriously. The afternoon had clarified something. Important Lila's interest in them appeared to be genuine, and his own feelings were becoming harder to ignore. But the practical concerns remained. What did a successful woman like Lila really see in a handyman raising his kid in a 2-bedroom apartment? "Maybe," he said finally. "What kind?" "Mrs. Rodriguez says roses are too serious for early dating, but daisies are too casual. She recommends tulips." How does Mrs. Rodriguez know so much about flowers? She's been married 4 times. She says she's an expert on romance. Dan laughed despite himself. 4 times? Yeah, but the last one stuck. Mr. Rodriguez has been around since before I was born. She says the secret is finding someone who makes you want to be better, but loves you exactly as you are. The wisdom in those words, delivered so casually by his 9-year-old son, hit Dan harder than it should have. That's actually pretty good advice. Mrs. Rodriguez is very wise. She also makes the best empanadas in the building. That night, after Mateo was asleep, Dan found himself standing in the kitchen, holding the business card Lila had given him. She'd written her personal number on the back in elegant handwriting that probably came from expensive schools and careful upbringing. He'd been thinking about her words at lunch, about Carlos and Miguel's praise for his work, about the possibility that maybe he was selling himself short. Not just professionally, but personally too. Maybe the real question wasn't why someone like Lila would be interested in someone like him, but why he was so convinced he wasn't worthy of her interest before he could second-guess himself. Bank picked up his phone and typed a message. Thank you for lunch today. The crew hasn't stopped talking about it. Would you like to have dinner again this week? I promise to actually cook this time. The response came back within minutes. I'd love that. Thursday? Thursday works? 6:30? Perfect. Should I bring anything? Dan smiled, remembering Mrs. Rodriguez's advice filtered through Mateo's innocent wisdom. Just yourself. I'll take care of the flowers. There was a pause before her next message. Flowers? Tulips. I'm told they strike the right balance between too serious and too casual. I can't wait to hear the story behind that advice. As Dan set down his phone and headed to bed, he realized something had shifted in the past few days. The careful walls he'd built around himself and Matteo weren't crumbling exactly, but they were developing windows. And maybe, he thought as he drifted off to sleep, that wasn't such a scary thing after all. The handwritten recipe card tucked into Lila's elegant stationery that arrived with a small package the next morning seemed to confirm that feeling. For homemade chocolate chip cookies, the note read. Mateo mentioned they were his favorites. The secret ingredient is letting him help mix the dough. Land held the expensive paper in his calloused hands and smiled. She was learning there. Language, the language of small gestures and everyday kindness that made a house feel like home. And despite his lingering uncertainties about their different worlds, he found himself looking forward to Thursday with an anticipation that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with hope. Thursday arrived with a kind of nervous energy that made Dan second-guess every decision from his choice of shirt to the dinner menu he'd planned and replanned 3 times. The tulips sat in a mason jar on the kitchen counter bright yellow, ones that Mateo had helped select from the grocery store floral section, pronouncing them perfect for someone as sunny as Lila. Mateo himself was practically vibrating with excitement, having appointed himself chief dinner preparation supervisor. He'd already set the table twice, rearranged the living room cushions for optimal conversation flow, and offered at least 6 suggestions for conversation topics that would show Lila how interesting our family is. Remember to ask about her favorite movies. Mateo instructed from his perch on the kitchen stool, where he was supposedly helping with the salad, but mostly providing commentary. And tell her about the time you fixed Mrs. Chun's sink and she cried because she was so happy. Ladies like men who make people cry happy tears. Where do you get this stuff? Dan asked, though he was smiling as he checked the chicken for the 3rd time. Mrs. Rodriguez gives very detailed advice. She says, romance is like cooking. It's all about timing and the right ingredients. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30, and Mateo shot off his stool like he'd been launched from a cannon. She's here. She's here. Do I look okay? Dan glanced at his son, who had insisted on wearing his best button-down shirt and had actually combed his hair without being asked. You look very handsome, Mio. You look nervous, Dad. Mrs. Rodriguez says ladies like confident men. Mrs. Rodriguez has a lot of opinions. She's usually right, though. Dan opened the door to find Lila holding a small wrapped package, wearing a soft green dress that made her eyes look almost emerald. Her smile was warm, but carried a hint of the same nervousness Dan was feeling. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi yourself." Dan accepted the package, noting its elegant wrapping. "You didn't need to bring anything. It's just something small for Matteo." She stepped inside, and Dan caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral. It seemed to fill their modest entryway with sophistication. "Layla," Matteo appeared. In the hallway, his earlier excitement now tempered with an almost formal politeness that made Dan's heart ache. His son was trying so hard to make a good impression. "Hello, handsome," Lila said, and Matteo's formality dissolved into his usual bright grin. "I brought you something." The package contained a book about paleontology, clearly expensive and beautifully illustrated. But it wasn't just any dinosaur book. It was written by a famous paleontologist and included a handwritten inscription from the author. Matteo's eyes went wide as he read the inscription aloud. To Matteo, a fellow scientist. Keep asking questions and never stop wondering. Dr. Sarah Martinez. How did you ... Then stared at the book, then at Lila. "I have a friend who knows Dr. Martinez," Lila said casually, though Dan caught something careful in her tone. "When I mentioned your son's interest in paleontology, she was happy to sign a book for him, and felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came when someone did something incredibly generous for Matteo. But underneath, the gratitude was a growing unease. First the expensive lunch, now a personalized book from a renowned scientist. These weren't casual gestures. "This is amazing." Matteo clutched the book to his chest. "Wait until I show Tommy. He's gonna be so jealous." Dinner went smoothly, filled with easy conversation and Matteo's enthusiastic descriptions of his latest school projects. Lila asked thoughtful questions about Dan's work and seemed genuinely interested in his stories about difficult repairs and satisfied customers. But Dan found himself studying her responses, looking for clues about who she really was. "You mentioned having a friend who knows Dr. Martinez," he said during a lull in Matteo's dinosaur commentary. "What do you do for work?" "I'm in business," Lila replied vaguely. "Consulting, mostly." "What kind of consulting?" "Wellness industry, helping companies improve their operational efficiency." The answer felt rehearsed, and Dan noticed she changed the subject quickly, asking Matteo about his upcoming school science fair. But the boy was already yawning, his excitement finally giving way to the exhaustion of a long day. "Someone's ready." "For bed," Dan observed. "Can Lila read me a story?" Matteo asked hopefully. "She has a really nice reading voice." Dan glanced at Lila, expecting polite deflection, but she nodded immediately. "I'd love to, if that's okay with your dad." Watching Lila read to his son felt both natural and profound. She sat on the edge of Matteo's bed, the expensive book balanced. On her knees, her voice carrying the perfect rhythm for bedtime stories. Matteo's eyes drooped as she read about ancient creatures and scientific discoveries, and by the time she closed the book, he was nearly asleep. "Thank you," he mumbled. "This was the best day ever." "Sweet dreams, scientist," Lila whispered, tucking the blanket around his shoulders with the practiced ease of someone who understood children. Back in the living room, Don poured coffee for himself and tea for Lila, noting again how perfectly she seemed to fit into their evening routine. They settled on the couch, and for a moment the silence was comfortable. "You're good with him," Ben said. "He makes it easy." "He's such a bright, curious boy." Lila sipped her tea thoughtfully. "You've done an amazing job raising him." "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Dan admitted. "For him to hit the angry teenage phase and blame me for all the ways I've screwed up his life." "What makes you think you've screwed up his life?" Dan gestured around their modest apartment. Look at this place. Look at what I can give him compared to what other kids have. His mom left because she wanted more than this, and sometimes I wonder if she was right. Mateo seems pretty happy. To me, for now. But what happens when he's older and realizes what he missed out on? Private schools, family vacations, college funds. Dan stopped himself, realizing how bitter he sounded. Dan, Lila's voice was gentle but firm. Can I tell you something about children and happiness? He nodded, though something in her tone made him wary. I grew up with everything money could buy. Private schools, tutors, trips around the world. My parents gave me every material advantage they could think of. She paused, staring into her tea. But they were so busy building their empire that they never had time for bedtime stories or help with homework or just ... being present. I would have traded all of it for what you give Mateo every single day. Which is what? Your complete attention. Your unwavering love. The knowledge that he's the most important thing in your world. Lila met his eyes. Trust me, that's worth more than any private school or fancy vacation. There was something raw in her voice that made Dan study her face more carefully. You sound like you're speaking from experience. I am. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. My parents meant well, but they confused providing for me with being present for me. Mateo will never have that confusion. Dan felt his throat tighten. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing him. Like he deserves better than a father who works with his hands and lives paycheck to paycheck. He deserves a father who loves him unconditionally and shows up for him every single day, which is exactly what he has. Lila reached over and touched his hand briefly. Don't you see how he looks at you? You're his hero, Dan, not because of what you can buy him, but because of who you are. The conversation was interrupted by a sound from Mateo's room, not quite crying, but the restless stirring that meant he'd had another bad dream. Dan started to get up, but Lila was already moving. May I? She asked softly. Dan nodded, following her down the hallway. They found Mateo sitting up in bed, looking disoriented and slightly scared. Hey, buddy, Dan said quietly. Bad dream? The dinosaurs were chasing me again, Mateo mumbled. But these ones were mean, not like the nice ones in my books. Dreams can be scary sometimes, Lila said, sitting on the edge of his bed. But you know what I learned about scary dreams? Mateo shook his head. They're just your brain's way of practicing being brave. Every time you have a scary dream and wake up okay, you get a little bit braver in real life. Really? Really? And besides, you've got the best dinosaur expert right here. She nodded toward Dan. Your dad knows everything about keeping dream. Dinosaurs away. Mateo looked at his father with renewed confidence. Yeah, Dad's the best at fixing scary things. Dan felt his chest tighten with emotion as he tucked Mateo back into bed. The ease with which Lila had handled the situation, the way she'd reinforced his role as protector while offering her own comfort, felt so natural it almost scared him. Later, as they stood by her car in the apartment complex parking lot, Dan struggled to find words for what he was feeling. Thank you, he said finally. For dinner, for the book, for being so good with him. Thank you for including me. For both. Dinners, actually. I can't remember the last time I felt so ... at home somewhere. Lila. Dan hesitated, then pushed forward. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. She tensed slightly. Okay. That book you brought Mateo, the inscription from Dr. Martinez, how did you really arrange that? I told you, I have a friend who... Nobody just happens to have a friend who can get personalized books from famous scientists on short notice. And lunch the other day that wasn't cheap food from some casual place. You're? He searched for the right words. You're not just comfortable financially, are you? Lila was quiet for a long moment, and Dan could see her weighing her response carefully. "No," she said finally. "I'm not just comfortable." "How not comfortable?" "Does it matter?" "It might. I need to know what I'm dealing with here, what Mateo's dealing with." "You're dealing with someone who cares about both of you. Someone who wants to spend time with you and share in your lives. Does the rest really matter?" Dan rubbed the back of his neck, frustrated. "It matters because I don't understand why someone like you would want to be part of our lives. And it matters because I don't want Matteo getting attached to someone who's going to disappear when the novelty wears off." "Is that what you think this is? Novelty?" "I don't know what to think. All I know is that you showed up out of nowhere. You're clearly used to a very different lifestyle than ours, and you're being incredibly generous to a kid you barely know. In my experience, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is." Leela's expression hardened slightly. "Your experience with your ex-wife, you mean?" "My experience with life in general." They stood in the parking lot under the harsh fluorescent lights, and Dan could feel the careful progress they'd made over the past week beginning to fracture. "I should go," Lila said quietly, "before we say things we'll regret." "Lila, wait." But she was already getting into her car, and Dan was left standing alone in the parking lot, wondering if his need for answers had just cost him something he hadn't realized he was starting to need. Back in his apartment, he found an envelope on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there before. Inside was an antique pocket watch, his grandfather's watch, the one he'd pawned 6 months ago to pay for Mateo's school supplies. There was a note with it, written in Lila's elegant handwriting. "Mateo mentioned this belonged to your grandfather. I thought it should be with your family where it belongs." Dan sank into a kitchen chair, holding the watch with trembling hands. The pawn shop owner had told him it was valuable, a genuine antique worth far more than the $100 he'd desperately needed. Getting it back would have cost at least twice what he'd received for it, and somehow Layla had known exactly what it meant to him and had returned it without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. The gesture was so thoughtful, so generous, and so impossible to accept that it made his chest ache with conflicted emotions. He was holding a piece of his family's history that he'd thought was lost forever, returned by a woman whose own history remained largely a mystery. And for the first time since this whole confusing situation had begun, Dan wondered if maybe the real question wasn't who Lila was, but whether he was brave enough to find out. The family tree assignment arrived on a Friday, delivered by Mrs. Patterson with the kind of cheerful enthusiasm that elementary school teachers reserved for projects they knew would cause parents to lose sleep. Matteo bounced through the front door, waving the instruction sheet like a victory flag, completely oblivious to the complexity of his task. "Dad, look what we get to do. We have to make a family tree with pictures and everything, and then present it to the class." Matteo spread the assignment on the kitchen table with reverent care. "Mrs. Patterson says it's going to help us understand our heritage and stuff." Dan read over the requirements with growing unease. Photos of family members going back at least 2 generations, stories about family traditions, a presentation about what makes your family special. For most kids, it would be straightforward. For Matteo, it highlighted every gap in their small family structure. "This looks like a big project," Dan said carefully. "We'll need to call Tia Maria for pictures of your grandparents." "What about Mom's side?" Matteo asked with the innocent directness that always caught Dan off guard. Dan's throat tightened. Mateo's mother had effectively disappeared from their lives when she left, taking with her any connection to her family. "We'll focus on Dad's side. That's plenty of family history. But Mrs. Patterson says we should include both sides if we can. What if I just put a question mark where Mom's family goes?" The casual way Matteo suggested this broke Dan's heart. His son had adapted to his mother's absence with the resilience of childhood, but moments like this revealed the holes that adaptation couldn't completely fill. We'll figure something out, Dan promised. Over the weekend, they spread the project materials across the living room floor poster board, markers, printed photos from Maria, and a growing pile of questions about relatives Dan barely remembered. Matteo approached the task with scientific precision, organizing photos by generation and creating elaborate charts that would have impressed a genealogist. I think we need more recent pictures, Matteo announced Sunday afternoon, surveying their work. Like pictures of our family now, doing normal family stuff. Dan looked at their collection of photos, mostly formal shots from holidays and special occasions. Nothing that captured their daily life, their quiet routines, the easy comfort they'd built together. Maybe we could ask someone to take pictures of us this week, Matteo suggested. Like at dinner or doing homework or something. The doorbell interrupted their planning session, and Matteo raced to answer it before Dan could stop him. Through the thin walls, Dan heard his son's delighted greeting, followed by a familiar voice. Lila! Matteo's excitement was unmistakable. Come see our family tree project. It's going to be amazing. Dan's stomach dropped. They hadn't spoken since Thursday night's awkward conversation in the parking lot, and he wasn't sure how to navigate seeing her again. But Matteo was already dragging her into the living room, chattering about poster boards and family heritage. This is quite a project, Lila said, taking in the organized chaos spread across their floor. She caught Dan's eye and offered a tentative smile. How's it going? Good, Matteo answered before Dan could speak. But we need more pictures of our family doing regular stuff. Dad says we mostly just have fancy pictures from holidays. That's a common problem with family photos, Lila replied seriously. The best family memories often happen during ordinary moments. Exactly. Matteo beamed at her understanding, like when Dad helps me with homework, or when we watch movies, or when we cook together. But we never think to take pictures of that stuff. Would you like me to take some pictures of you both this week? Lila offered. I'd be happy to capture some of those ordinary moments. Don opened his mouth to politely decline, but Matteo was already jumping up and down with excitement. Yes, that would be perfect. You could come for dinner again and take pictures of us cooking, and maybe tomorrow you could take pictures of Dad, helping me with homework. Matteo, Dan started, but Lila was already nodding. I'd love to help. If that's okay with your dad, of course. The careful way she deferred to his authority, the genuine warmth in her offer, made it impossible for Dan to refuse. That would be ... helpful. Thank you. Monday evening, Lila arrived with a professional quality camera and the patience of someone accustomed to working with children. She moved around their apartment like a documentary photographer, capturing candid moments Dan never would have thought to preserve. Matteo at the kitchen table, brow furrowed in concentration as Dan explained long division. Dan ruffling his son's hair after a correct answer. The two of them cooking dinner together, Matteo standing on a stool to reach the stove while Dan guided his hands. Simple moments that suddenly seemed precious when viewed through Lila's lens. You're really good at this, Dan observed as she showed them the digital display. I took a photography class once, Lila replied, which Dan suspected was an understatement. But honestly, you two make it easy. You have such natural chemistry together. Dad's the best teacher, Matteo announced. He never gets mad when I don't understand stuff right away. That's because learning takes time, Dan said automatically. Everyone learns differently. See? Matteo looked at Lila with pride. He's really smart about kid stuff. Tuesday brought parent-teacher conferences, an annual ritual that always made Dan slightly nervous despite Matteo's consistently good grades. He'd arranged to leave work early, but a plumbing emergency at the Henderson house threatened to make him late. I could go with you, Lila offered when he called to explain the situation, as a family friend. Just to take notes if you're running behind. Dan's first instinct was to decline parent-teacher conferences felt deeply personal, and he wasn't. Sure, he was ready for Lila to see him in that parental role. But Mrs. Patterson had mentioned some concerns about Mateo's latest writing assignment, and Dan didn't want to miss important information because he was distracted by rushing. "If you're sure you don't mind," he said finally. "I don't mind at all. Mateo's important to me too." The simple statement hit Dan harder than it should have. When was the last time anyone had considered Matteo important enough to rearrange their schedule for him? Mrs. Patterson greeted Lila with the warm professionalism elementary school teachers used for non-traditional family configurations. In a world of divorced parents, step-families, and guardians, one extra adult at a conference wasn't unusual. "Matteo is such a joy to have in class," Mrs. Patterson began, spreading out examples of his work. His curiosity and empathy really stand out. Dan relaxed as the conference proceeded. Mateo's grades were excellent, his social development was on track, and his teachers consistently praised his kindness toward other students. "There is one thing I wanted to discuss," Mrs. Patterson said, pulling out a writing assignment. "We asked the children to write about their families, and Mateo's response was ... interesting." Dan's stomach tightened as he read his son's careful handwriting. "My family is me and my dad. My dad works really hard to take care of me, and he's the best dad in the world. We don't have a mom in our family right now, but maybe someday we will. My dad gets lonely sometimes, but he doesn't think. I notice. I think our family is perfect the way it is, but it could be even more perfect if it was bigger." "Oh," Dan breathed. "It's a beautiful piece of writing," Mrs. Patterson assured him quickly. "Very honest and thoughtful. But I wanted to make sure you knew how perceptive he is about family dynamics." Dan felt heat rise in his cheeks. His son's innocent honesty had laid bare feelings Dan thought he'd kept private. Beside him, Lila reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. "Children are remarkably observant," she said quietly. "It sounds like Matteo feels very secure in your love, while also being aware of your feelings. That's actually a sign of emotional maturity." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Exactly. He's developing excellent emotional intelligence. I just wanted you to know that he's processing these family questions in a very healthy way." Walking to the parking lot afterward, Dan felt emotionally wrung out. "I had no idea he thought about it so much," he admitted. "About me being lonely, about our family maybe getting bigger someday. He loves you very much," Lila said gently. "And he wants you to be happy." "I am happy. I mean, I thought I was." Dan rubbed his neck in frustration. "God, listening to his teacher talk about his writing made me realize how much I've been fooling myself." "About what?" "About being enough for him. About our life being complete as it is." Dan looked at Lila, who was listening with the same patient attention she'd shown all evening. "He's right, you know. I do get lonely. And maybe our family could be bigger. Dan, you've been amazing with him. With both of us. These past few weeks..." Dan struggled to find the right words. "I haven't felt this comfortable with someone since before my marriage fell apart. Matteo adores you, and you're so natural with him. It's like you've always been part of our lives." They'd reached Lila's car, but neither made a move toward their respective vehicles. "There's something I need to tell you," Lila said quietly. "About the other night? Dan, I know you have questions about my background, and you have every right to ask them. I've been deliberately vague because you're protecting yourself," Dan finished. "I get that. I've been doing the same thing." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been so focused on protecting Matteo and myself from getting hurt that I almost missed something really good happening right in front of me." Dan took a step closer to her. "I don't need to know everything about your past to know that I trust you with my son. And I don't need to understand why someone like you would want to be with someone like me to know that I want to find out. Dan, let me finish. I've been scared because Matteo's already attached to you, and if this doesn't work out, it'll break his heart. But maybe I should be more scared of missing the chance to see where this goes." Lila was very still, and in the parking lot's dim lighting, Dan couldn't read her expression clearly. "What are you saying?" she asked finally. "I'm saying that maybe Matteo was right that first day at the fair. Maybe we do need someone to take care of us when he grows up. Maybe our family could be bigger." Dan took a deep breath. "I'm saying I think I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me, but not as much as the thought of letting you walk away." The words hung between them in the quiet evening air, and Dan realized his heart was beating so hard he could hear it. He'd laid himself completely open, admitted feelings he barely understood himself, and now all he could do was wait for her response. "Dan," Lila said softly, and he could hear tears in her voice, "I think I'm falling in love with you too." Before he could fully process what she'd said, she was stepping into his arms, and he was kissing her in the school parking lot like a teenager. Her lips were soft and warm, and she tasted like the future, uncertain but full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lila rested her forehead against his. "This is complicated," she whispered. "Most good things are," Dan replied. "There are things about my life, about who I am, that might change how you feel about this, about me." Dan cupped her face gently, studying her expression in the dim light. "Are you a good person, Lila?" "I try to be." "Do you care about Matteo?" "Very much." "Do you care about me?" "Yes, and whatever else there is, we'll figure it out together." Dan kissed her forehead softly. "I'm tired of being afraid of everything that could go wrong. Maybe it's time to focus on everything that could go right." That night, after Matteo had fallen asleep clutching his signed dinosaur book, Dan sat in his quiet living room holding his grandfather's pocket watch and thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been whether his truck would pass inspection. Now he was in love with a woman whose generosity puzzled him, whose background remained largely mysterious, and whose presence in their lives had become as essential as breathing. The family tree project sat half-finished on the coffee table, photos and memories scattered across poster board. Tomorrow, he'd help Matteo add the new pictures Lila had taken, capturing moments that showed their family, not as it had always been, but as it was becoming. For the first time in years, Dan fell asleep thinking not about tomorrow's problems or next month's bills, but about the possibility that their small family might be about to become something larger, richer, and more complete than he'd ever dared to imagine. The Roosevelt Elementary Library smelled like old books and industrial carpet cleaner, a combination that Matteo found oddly comforting as he settled into his favorite corner with a stack of research materials. Mrs. Patterson had given the class a week to finish their family tree projects, and Matteo was determined to make his the most comprehensive presentation in third-grade history. "Remember, we want to learn about interesting people in our families," Mrs. Patterson had announced that morning. "Maybe someone has an ancestor who was a pioneer, or a relative who has an unusual job, or a family friend who's accomplished something special." That's when the idea had struck him. Lila was practically family. Now she'd been to dinner 3 times, helped with homework, and Dad got that dopey smile whenever her name came up. She definitely qualified as an interesting person, and Matteo was curious about what made her so special that even Mrs. Rodriguez approved of her. "I want to do research about interesting people," Matteo announced to Miss Chun, the school librarian, who was known for her ability to find information about absolutely anything. "What kind of interesting people?" Miss Chun asked, settling beside him at the computer terminal. "Well, there's this lady who's friends with my dad, and she's really nice and smart, and she knows famous scientists and stuff. I want to find out what makes her so special." Ms. Chun smiled. "That sounds like a wonderful addition to your family tree." "What's her name?" "Lila Tran. She just moved here from somewhere else, and she's really good at helping people." Ms. Chun's fingers flew over the keyboard as she helped Mateo navigate the search engines. Let's see what we can find. Sometimes the most interesting people are the ones who seem ordinary on the surface. The first few results were unremarkable: a LinkedIn profile for a business consultant, some social media accounts set to private. But then Ms. Chan tried a different search approach, adding terms like business and entrepreneur to the query. "Oh my," Ms. Chan said quietly, staring at the screen. "What? Did you find something? Matteo, is this the same Lila Tran?" Ms. Chan pointed to a Forbes magazine article from 2 years ago. The headline read, "The Wellness Revolution: How Lila Tran Built a Billion-Dollar Empire from Ancient Wisdom." Matteo squinted at the screen, studying the professional headshot that accompanied the article. It was definitely Lila, though she looked more formal and serious than the woman who read him bedtime stories and helped with his homework. "That's her, but what does billion-dollar empire mean?" Miss Chung read the article's opening paragraph aloud, her voice growing more amazed with each sentence. "Lila Tran, 55, is the founder and CEO of Tranquil Path Wellness, a multinational corporation that has revolutionized the health and wellness industry. Starting with a single meditation app developed in her San Francisco apartment, Tran has built a business empire that now includes wellness retreats, organic food products, mindfulness training programs, and a chain of luxury spas across 3 continents." "Wait," Matteo interrupted, his 9-year-old brain struggling to process the information. "Lila is super rich?" "According to this article, she's worth approximately $2.3 billion, Ms. Chan said slowly. "That would make her one of the wealthiest women in California." Matteo stared at the screen, trying to reconcile the woman who helped him with his science projects with the business mogul smiling from the Forbes cover. "But she drives a regular car, and she wears normal clothes, and she knows how to make cookies from scratch." "Sometimes the most successful people are also the most down-to-earth," Ms. Chan said gently. "Should we print this article for your project?" "Yes, please." Matteo's voice was small as he watched the printer produce page after page of information about Lila's business achievements, her philanthropic efforts, her reputation as a visionary leader in the wellness industry. The article painted a picture of a woman who had built her empire through careful innovation and genuine desire to help people improve their lives. It mentioned her reclusive nature, her avoidance of publicity, and her recent decision to step back from day-to-day operations to focus on personal projects and community involvement. It says here she recently moved to a smaller community to explore new ways of making a positive impact on people's lives, Ms. Chun noted. "That must be why she's here." Matteo nodded, though his mind was reeling. If Lila was worth billions of dollars, what was she doing having dinner in their tiny apartment? Why did she seem so interested in his homework and his dad's work stories? Why did she act like spending time with them was the highlight of her week? "Miss Chun?" Matteo's voice was uncertain. "If someone is really, really rich and they make friends with people who aren't rich, does that mean they're being fake?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Like, if Lila has so much money and such an important job, why would she want to hang out with me and my dad? We're just ... normal." Ms. Chun knelt down to Matteo's eye level, her expression gentle but serious. "Matteo, money doesn't change what kind of person someone is on the inside. Some wealthy people are wonderful, and some aren't. Just like some people without much money are wonderful, and some aren't. What matters is how someone treats you, and whether they make you feel valued." "Lila makes me feel really special," Matteo admitted. "Like when she listens to me talk about dinosaurs and asks really good questions. And she makes Dad smile more than he has in a really long time." "Then maybe that's what's important," Miss Chan suggested. "Not how much money she has, but how she makes your family feel." But as Matteo walked home that afternoon, the printed article clutched in his backpack, he couldn't shake his confusion. If Lila was so successful and important, why hadn't she told them? And why did his dad seem nervous around her sometimes, like he was worried about not being good enough? At dinner that evening, Matteo pushed his spaghetti around his plate while wrestling with questions too big for his 9-year-old vocabulary. "You're quiet tonight, buddy," Dan observed. "Everything okay at school?" "Dad," Matteo set down his fork and looked directly at his father. "Do you think rich people can be real friends with regular people?" Dan nearly choked on his water. Where did that question come from? Just wondering, like, if someone had a lot of money, would they still want to be friends with us? "I think," Dan said carefully, "that real friendship isn't about money. It's about caring about each other and enjoying spending time together." "Why do you ask?" "No reason." Matteo returned to his spaghetti, but Dan could see something was bothering him. Later that evening, after Matteo had gone to bed, Dan was reviewing invoices at the kitchen table when he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. His son appeared in dinosaur pajamas, clutching a piece of paper. "Dad, I need to tell you something important." Dan set aside his paperwork, recognizing the tone that meant Matteo had something serious on his mind. "What's up, Mio?" "I was doing research for my family tree project, and I found out something about Lila." Matteo held out the Forbes article with the solemnity of someone delivering crucial intelligence. Dan's blood ran cold as he saw the headline. His hands trembled slightly as he took the article, scanning the opening paragraphs with growing disbelief. "Matteo," he said slowly, "where did you get this?" "Ms. Chun helped me look up interesting people for my project. I wanted to include Lila because she's practically family now, right?" Matteo's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But Dad, this says she's worth billions of dollars. That's like 1,000 millions, right?" Dan stared at the article, pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. The expensive clothes he'd noticed, but couldn't afford to really consider. The casual way she'd arranged for personalized books from famous scientists. The lunch that had fed his entire crew without her batting an eye. His grandfather's pocket watch, returned as if it were a simple trinket rather than a significant financial gesture. "Dad, are you okay? You look kind of sick." Dan struggled to find words. "I'm processing this information." "Is it bad that she's super rich?" "Mrs. Rodriguez says money doesn't make people bad, but it can make them weird about stuff." Dan continued reading, learning about Lila's business empire, her reputation for innovation, her estimated net worth that was more than he could comprehend. The article mentioned her recent retreat from public life, her move to a smaller community, her interest in authentic human connections, free from the complications of wealth and status. "She never told us," Dan said quietly. "Maybe she was scared we'd treat her different," Matteo suggested. "Like how Tommy acts weird around me when his parents fight, because he thinks I might judge him or something." The innocent wisdom in his son's observation hit Dan like a physical blow. Had Lila been protecting herself the same way he'd been, protecting himself, afraid that the truth about her circumstances would change everything? But even as he tried to rationalize her secrecy, Dan felt a familiar anger building in his chest. The anger of being lied to, of being made to feel foolish, of realizing that every interaction they'd had was built on a fundamental deception. "Dad?" Matteo's voice was small. "Are you mad at Lila?" "I don't know what I am," Dan admitted. "Confused, hurt, angry that she didn't trust us enough to tell us the truth. But maybe she was going to tell us eventually. Maybe she just needed to make sure we liked her for who she is, not for her money." Dan looked at his son, whose face showed the kind of mature understanding that sometimes caught him off guard. "You really think that's what this is about?" "I think Lila is lonely," Matteo said simply, "like you were before we met her. And I think she was scared that if we knew she was super rich, we'd think she was only being nice to us because she felt sorry for us." "And you don't think that's what this is?" "Dad," Matteo's voice carried absolute certainty, Nobody pretends to like my dinosaur facts just because they feel sorry for me. And nobody helps with homework and takes pictures for family projects and reads bedtime stories unless they really, really care. Dan felt his anger wavering in the face of his son's logic, but the hurt remained. She should have told us, Matteo. We should have known who she really was. Maybe she was trying to figure out who she really was, too, Matteo suggested. Maybe when you have lots of money, it's hard to know if people like the real you or just the rich you. They sat in the quiet kitchen, father and son wrestling with questions about truth and trust, and what it meant when someone you cared about turned out to be someone completely different than you thought. What do we do now? Matteo asked finally. Dan stared at the Forbes article, at the photo of Lila in an expensive suit standing in what appeared to be a corporate boardroom, looking like she belonged in a world he couldn't even imagine. Then he thought about the woman who'd sat on Matteo's bed reading dinosaur books, who'd photographed their ordinary moments with such care, who'd returned his grandfather's watch without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. I don't know, he said. Honestly, I really don't know. That night, after Matteo had finally gone back to bed, Dan sat alone in his living room, holding the article and his grandfather's pocket watch, trying to understand how someone worth $2.3 billion had ended up in his kitchen making spaghetti sauce from a jar, trying to understand why someone with access to anything money could buy had seemed so genuinely happy helping a 9-year-old with his homework. Most of all, trying to understand whether the woman he'd fallen in love with was real, or if she was just another role played by someone who could afford to try on different lives like expensive clothes. The question swirled in his mind until dawn, when he finally fell into an uneasy sleep with one certainty. Everything had changed, and he had no idea how to change it back. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had opened overnight. 2 weeks had passed since Matteo's discovery. 2 weeks since Dan had confronted Lila about the Forbes article. 2 weeks since she'd walked away from their apartment, with tears in her eyes and a quiet promise that she'd give them space to think. Space to think had turned into space to regret, space to second-guess, and space for the kind of bone-deep loneliness that made Dan question every decision he'd made since that day at the community fair. Matteo had become a shadow of his usual exuberant self. He completed his homework without enthusiasm, ate his meals without commentary, and went to bed each night without asking when Lila might come back. The silence from his son was somehow worse than any tantrum would have been. Dad? Matteo's voice drifted from the kitchen table, where he was half-heartedly working on a math worksheet. Do you think Lila knows we miss her? Dan looked up from the invoice he'd been staring at without really seeing for the past 20 minutes. I think she probably misses us too, buddy. Then why doesn't she come back? It was the same question Matteo had asked, in various forms, for the past 14 days. And Dan still didn't have a good answer. Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be, Dan said finally. Mrs. Rodriguez says you're being an idiot. Matteo! Her words, not mine. Matteo set down his pencil and turned in his chair to face his father fully. She says pride is a luxury we can't afford, and that if you love someone, you should tell them before they disappear forever. Dan rubbed his temples, where a persistent headache had taken up residence. It's not that simple. Why not? Because she lied to us, Matteo. For weeks, she let us believe she was just a normal person when all along she was. She was ... rich. Matteo's voice held the particular patience children used when explaining obvious things to confused adults. So what? So what? Dan's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. So she watched me worry about money. Watched me count every dollar. Watched me be embarrassed about what I couldn't afford to give you. And she knew the whole time that she could buy and sell everything I own without thinking twice about it. Maybe she didn't tell us because she knew you'd act exactly like this. Matteo said with devastating 9-year-old logic. The observation hit Dan like a physical blow, mostly because he suspected it was true. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that his reaction had proven every assumption Lila might have made about him. Dad, Matteo continued, his voice growing more serious, remember when Tommy's family got that new car, and he stopped wanting to come over here because he was embarrassed about our apartment? Don nodded, remembering the awkward phase when Matteo's best friend had suddenly seemed uncomfortable in their modest home. And remember what you told me? You said that real friends don't care about stuff like cars and apartments and clothes. You said what matters is how people treat each other. This is different. How? Dan opened his mouth to explain the difference, then realized he couldn't articulate it in a way that would make sense to a child. Or maybe he couldn't articulate it in a way that made sense at all. The knock at the door interrupted his internal struggle. Dan's heart leaped for a moment. Maybe Lila had decided to come back, to fight for whatever they'd been building together. But when he opened the door, he found Mrs. Rodriguez standing in the hallway holding an envelope. This came to my mailbox by mistake, she announced, though Dan suspected there was nothing mistaken about it. Mrs. Rodriguez had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial relationship counselor, and subtlety wasn't her strong suit. Envelope was addressed to Dan in Lila's elegant handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery and a smaller sealed envelope marked for Matteo. Dan's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. Dear Dan, I've started this letter a dozen times, each attempt sounding more inadequate than the last. How do you apologize for a deception that was never meant to hurt, but ended up causing exactly the pain I was trying to avoid? I never told you about my business or my financial situation because I was selfish. For the first time in years, I was experiencing what it felt like to be valued for who I am rather than what I can provide. You and Matteo saw me as just Lila, not as a CEO or a resource or a solution to problems. You argued with me, challenged me, let me help with homework, and take pictures and read bedtime stories because you thought I was worth knowing, not because you thought I was worth using. I was wrong to keep the truth from you. I was wrong to make that choice for both of us. I was wrong to let you worry about money and pride and providing for Matteo when I could have helped without judgment or expectation. I see that now, and I'm sorrier than I know how to express. But I wasn't wrong about falling in love with you. Both. I wasn't wrong about the way you've made me feel seen and valued and needed in ways that have nothing to do with my bank account. I wasn't wrong about thinking that maybe, possibly, I could be part of your family. I'm leaving tomorrow. I've sold the house here and arranged to relocate to Portland, where I'll be establishing a new wellness center focused on supporting single-parent families. It seems like appropriate penance for my mistakes. I wanted you to know that the time I spent with you and Matteo was the most authentic I've felt in years. You helped me remember who I was before success complicated everything. I hope someday you can forgive me for not being brave enough to trust you with the whole truth from the beginning. Please tell Matteo that his instincts about family and love are perfect, and that he should never let anyone convince him otherwise. Tell him that he has the most wonderful father in the world, and that any woman would be lucky to love you both. All my love, Lila. P.S. I've arranged for a trust fund for Matteo's education. It's set up through my attorney, completely anonymous, and accessible when he's ready for college. Please don't see this as charity, see it as an investment in a brilliant boy's future by someone who believes in him completely. Dan read the letter twice, then a third time, each reading making his chest tighter with regret and recognition. She was leaving. Tomorrow. And suddenly all his principles about pride and dignity seemed petty compared to the reality of losing someone who had become essential to their happiness. What did she say? Matteo asked quietly. Dan looked at his son, who was watching him with the careful attention children used when they sensed adult drama that might affect their world. She said goodbye, Dan admitted. She's moving to Portland tomorrow. Mateo's face crumpled. Forever? I think so. Because you were mean to her? The simple question was like a knife to Dan's heart. Because I was scared, Mio. Because I let my pride get in the way of what was important. Can't you fix it? Dan stared at his son, at the hope and determination in his young face, and realized that maybe he'd been asking himself the wrong questions. Instead of wondering why someone like Lila would want to be with someone like him, maybe he should have been asking why he thought he didn't deserve happiness. Instead of focusing on their different circumstances, maybe he should have been focusing on how perfectly they fit together despite those differences. Maybe, Dan said slowly, but it would mean doing something pretty dramatic and probably embarrassing. Like, what? Like chasing her to the airport and telling her I was wrong. Like admitting that I'd rather have her in our lives with billions of dollars than not have her at all. Like asking her to stay and marry us anyway. Matteo's eyes lit up with an excitement Dan hadn't seen in 2 weeks. Yes, let's do that. Matteo, it's not that simple. She might not want to see me. She might be too hurt to forgive me. She might have already moved on. Dad. Matteo stood up from his chair with the determination of someone who'd made an important decision. Remember what you told me when I was scared to ride my bike without training wheels? That you had to try, even if you might fall? And you said that falling wasn't the worst thing that could happen. You said the worst thing would be never knowing if I could do it. Matteo crossed his arms with stubborn certainty. Well, this is like that. Maybe Lila will say no, but maybe she'll say yes. And if we don't try, we'll never know. Dan looked at. His son really looked at him and saw not just a 9-year-old boy, but a wise and brave person who understood love better than most adults. Who understood that sometimes the biggest risk was not taking any risk at all. You're right, Dan said, feeling something shift in his chest, something that felt like hope and determination, and the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop fighting what you know is true. You're absolutely right. So we're gonna go get her? We're gonna go get her. Matteo's whoop of excitement could probably be heard 3 apartments away, but Dan didn't care. For the first time in 2 weeks, he felt like himself again, like the man who raised a confident, empathetic boy, like someone who deserved love and happiness, like someone brave enough to fight for what mattered most. The logistics were daunting. He didn't know Lila's flight time or even which airline she might be using. He didn't know if she'd listen to him or if she'd already made peace with her decision to leave. He didn't know if showing up at the airport would be romantic or just stalkerish. But as he watched Matteo race to his room to pack supplies for the airport mission, Dan realized that none of those uncertainties mattered as much as the certainty that he loved Lila Tran, billionaire or not, and that he was tired of letting fear make his decisions for him, that it was time to be as brave as his 9-year-old son, who'd never doubted that love was worth fighting for. Dad, Matteo called from his bedroom. Should I bring the family tree project? The one with all the pictures Lila took? I think she should see how she fits in our family. Bring everything, buddy. Dan called back, already reaching for his keys. We're going to need all the help we can get. As they prepared for what might be the most important trip of their lives, Dan found himself thinking about that first day at the community fair, when Matteo had boldly asked a stranger to marry his father. His son had seen something, and that Dan was only now beginning to understand, that sometimes the most important connections happen when you least expect them, and that love doesn't care about bank accounts or social status or any of the barriers adults create to protect themselves. Tomorrow, they'd find out if it was too late to fix his mistakes. Tomorrow, they'd discover whether love really could conquer pride and fear and all the complications that came with letting someone into your heart. But tonight, for the first time in 2 weeks, Dan fell asleep feeling hopeful. The drive to Los Angeles International Airport took 2 hours and 43 minutes, during which Dan second-guessed his decision approximately every 30 seconds, while Mateo maintained the unwavering confidence of someone whose faith in love's triumph had never been tested by adult complications. What if her flight already left? Dan asked for the 5th time as they merged onto the 405 freeway. Then we'll find out where she went and follow her, Mateo replied matter-of-factly, carefully holding the poster board he'd insisted on bringing. Mrs. Rodriguez says love doesn't give up just because of airplane schedules. What if she doesn't want to see me? She will. How can you be so sure? Because she wrote you a letter instead of just disappearing. If she didn't want to see you anymore, she would have just left without saying anything. Mateo's 9-year-old logic was unassailable. Besides, I made something that will change her mind. Dan glanced in the rearview mirror at his son, who was clutching a poster board covered with a sheet. What did you make? It's a surprise. But it's really good. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me with the words. The closer they got to Lax, the more Dan's nervousness transformed into determination. This was either the most romantic gesture of his life, or the most spectacular public humiliation he'd ever orchestrated. But either way, he'd know he'd tried. Either way, Matteo would see that sometimes fighting for what you love was worth the risk of failure. The challenge became apparent as soon as they entered the departures level. LAX was enormous, serving dozens of airlines with hundreds of flights, departing daily. Finding one specific passenger without knowing her flight details was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a small city. Okay, Dan said, parking in short-term parking and trying to project more confidence than he felt. We need a plan. I already have a plan, Matteo announced, shouldering his backpack with military precision. We go to the fancy airplane part? The fancy airplane part? You know, where rich people fly. Lila probably doesn't fly on regular airplanes like us. Dan stared at his son, realizing that once again, Mateo's innocent observations were probably accurate. Someone worth billions probably flew private, which meant they needed to find the private aviation terminals. The quest took them through 3 different terminal buildings and involved conversations with approximately a dozen airport employees, most of whom looked at Dan and Matteo with the particular skepticism reserved for people asking unusual questions in post-9/11's airports. Sir, I can't give out passenger information, explained the 4th security guard they'd approached, even if I wanted to help you with your ... romantic gesture. We're not trying to get passenger information, Matteo interjected with the serious tone he used for important negotiations. We just want to know where the private airplanes are so we can make a sign and wait there. It's very important. The security guard, whose name tag read Marcus, looked down at Matteo with the expression of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. What kind of sign? Marcus asked. Matteo carefully uncovered his poster board, revealing a colorful creation that took Dan's breath away. In bold letters across the top, it read, Will you marry my dad? Just like his original question at the community fair, but this time surrounded by photos from their family tree project, pictures of Dan and Matteo cooking dinner, doing homework, laughing together. And in the center, carefully pasted, were the photos Lila had taken of their ordinary moments, showing 3 people who looked like they belonged together. Oh, Marcus said softly. Oh, that's really something. It's our family, Matteo explained. But it's not complete without Lila, and she's leaving today because my dad was scared about her being rich. But now he realizes that money doesn't matter as much as love. Dan felt his face burning with embarrassment, but Marcus was nodding approvingly. You know what? Marcus said, glancing around conspiratorially. Private aviation is in the Tom Bradley International Terminal, West Side. But you didn't hear it from me. Thank you, Matteo beamed. I hope someone makes a sign for you someday. The Tom Bradley Terminal's private aviation section was a world unto itself, sleek, quiet, and obviously expensive. Dan felt profoundly out of place in his work clothes and scuffed boots, but Matteo marched forward with the confidence of someone on a mission from the universe itself. "Excuse me," Matteo approached the reception desk with his poster board held high. "We're looking for our friend Lila. She's probably getting on a private airplane to Portland, and we need to tell her something very important before she leaves." The woman behind the desk, elegant, professional, and clearly accustomed to unusual requests from wealthy clients, looked from Matteo to Dan with growing interest. "I'm sorry, but I can't provide information about our passengers," she said gently. "But I have to say, that's a beautiful sign. Would it be okay if we just waited here?" Dan asked. "In case she comes through? We're not trying to cause any trouble. We just ... We need to tell her we were wrong." The woman studied them for a long moment, taking in Dan's obvious nervousness, Matteo's determined hope, and the handmade poster that told their story in pictures and bold marker letters. "There's a seating area over there," she said finally, pointing to a corner of the terminal. "It has a good view of the departure gates. Hypothetically, if someone were waiting for a friend, that would be a good place to sit." "Thank you," Dan said, meaning it completely. They settled into the plush seating area, and Dan realized his hands were shaking. What had seemed like a romantic gesture in theory felt increasingly desperate in practice. What if Lila took one look at them and kept walking? What if she thought he was only here because he'd learned about the trust fund? "What if, Dad?" Matteo said quietly. "Look." Dan followed his son's gaze toward the departure gates, and his heart stopped. There she was, Lila, elegant even in travel clothes, pulling a small suitcase and walking with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a difficult decision and was determined to follow through with it. "She's here," Matteo whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make her disappear. "She's here," Dan agreed, his voice tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. "Are you ready?" Dan looked at his son, at the poster board that represented all their hopes for the future, at the woman who had changed their lives simply by being herself. He thought about all the reasons this might not work, all the ways it could go wrong, all the logical arguments against what they were about to do. Then he thought about Matteo's wisdom, Mrs. Rodriguez's advice, and the simple truth that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. "Yeah, buddy," Dan said, standing up and taking a deep breath. "I'm ready." Matteo jumped up with his poster held high, and together they walked toward the woman who had become their definition of family, even if she didn't know it yet. Lila was 20 feet from the departure gate when she heard her name called in a voice that made her heart stop and stumble. She turned slowly, certain she was imagining things, certain that grief and regret had finally made her hallucinate the voices she most wanted to hear. But there they were, Dan and Matteo, running toward her across the polished terminal floor. Matteo held a poster board above his head like a banner, and Dan's face carried an expression of desperate hope that made Lila's carefully constructed composure crumble instantly. "Lila!" Matteo reached her first, breathless and grinning. "We found you. We drove all the way here to stop you from leaving." "Matteo?" Lila's voice came out as a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Dad realized he was being stupid about the money thing. Matteo announced with characteristic directness. "And I made this to show you that you're part of our family, no matter what." He held up the poster board, and Lila felt tears spring to her eyes as she took in the careful arrangement of photos and the bold declaration that had started everything. "Will you marry my dad?" "Oh my God," she breathed, looking from the sign to Matteo's hopeful face to Dan, who had stopped a few feet away and was watching her with an expression of raw vulnerability. "I know you're probably angry with me," Dan said, his voice carrying across the space between them. "I know I handled everything wrong, and I know I have no right to ask you to stay. But I couldn't let you leave without telling you that I was an idiot. Other travelers were beginning to notice the scene unfolding in the terminal. A few people slowed their pace, drawn by Mateo's poster and the obvious drama playing out in front of them. Dan, Lila started, but he held up a hand. Please, let me say this. I was so focused on protecting myself and Matteo from getting hurt that I hurt us all instead. I was so worried about not being enough for you that I couldn't see that maybe you needed us as much as we needed you. Lila's throat tightened as she listened to him lay his heart bare in front of a growing audience of curious strangers. The truth is, Dan continued, stepping closer, I don't care if you're worth $1 billion or 10 cents. I don't care if you live in a mansion or a cardboard box. I care that you make Matteo laugh. I care that you listen to his dinosaur facts like they're the most important thing in the world. I care that you make me feel like I might actually deserve to be happy. Dad's really good at speeches when he's not being scared, Matteo added helpfully. A small crowd had gathered now, watching with the fascination people reserve for public proposals and other displays of high-stakes romance. Lila was barely aware of them, her entire focus on the man in front of her and the words that were healing wounds she'd carried for longer than she cared to admit. You were right to keep your secret, Dan said, his voice growing stronger. Because if you'd told me on that first day that you were Lila Tran, CEO of whatever, I probably would have been too intimidated to let myself fall in love with you. And that would have been the biggest mistake of my life. The biggest mistake ever, Matteo agreed solemnly. So we're asking if you'll give us another chance. If you'll come home with us and help us figure out how to make this work. Because I love you, Lila. Not your money, not your success, not what you can do for us. I love you for the way you read bedtime stories and take pictures of ordinary moments and make our little family feel complete. Dan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. Layla's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple diamond ring, not large or flashy, but beautiful in its classic elegance. I bought this with my own money, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's not much compared to what you're used to, but it's mine to give, and I'm hoping it's enough. The crowd around them had grown larger, and Lila could hear whispered commentary and the occasional awe from their impromptu audience. But all she could see was Dan, kneeling in front of her in an airport terminal, offering her his heart with a sincerity that made her chest ache. Dan, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I know this is crazy, he continued. I know we've only known each other for a few weeks. And I know there are probably 1,000 reasons why this won't work. But Matteo was right that first day at the fair. Sometimes you just know. Sometimes you just know, Lila repeated, her voice breaking. So Lila Tran, Dan said, his eyes never leaving her face, will you marry me? Will you marry us? Will you? Help us figure out how to blend your world with ours and create something new together? The terminal had gone quiet around them, dozens of strangers holding their breath as they waited for her answer. Matteo clutched his poster board like a talisman, his face bright with hope and certainty. Lila looked at the ring, simple and perfect, and chosen with love rather than obligation. She looked at Matteo, whose faith in the power of family had brought them to this moment. She looked at Dan, whose courage in admitting his mistakes had given them all a second chance. Yes, she said, her voice barely audible. Yes, Dan's face lit up with disbelief and joy. Yes, Lila laughed through her tears, reaching down to help him stand. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll come home. Yes to all of it. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause as Dan slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. Matteo whooped and thrust his poster board into the air like a victory flag, his mission finally complete. I knew it, he announced to anyone within hearing distance. I knew she'd say yes. I'm the best matchmaker ever. Dan and Lila broke apart, laughing and crying simultaneously as Matteo launched himself into their embrace. The three of them stood together in the middle of LAX's private terminal, surrounded by cheering strangers and holding each other like they'd never let go. "How did you find me?" Lila asked, still not quite believing they were real. Matteo figured. "Out you'd fly private," Dan explained. "And Mrs. Rodriguez said love doesn't give up because of airplane schedules." "Mrs. Rodriguez is very wise," Lila agreed, kissing Mateo's forehead. "And you, my brilliant boy, are the best family project coordinator in the world." "Does this mean we don't have to finish the family tree assignment?" Mateo asked hopefully. "Oh no," Lila grinned. "Now we get to start a whole new page." As airport security gently dispersed their audience, and the three of them gathered Lila's luggage, Dan marveled at the strange turns life could take. 3 hours ago, he'd been sitting in his apartment wondering if he'd lost the best thing that had ever happened to them. Now he was engaged to a billionaire who loved him and his son enough to change her entire life plan based on a poster board and a speech in an airport terminal. "So what happens now?" he asked as they walked toward the exit. "Now we go home," Lila said simply. "We figure out the details as we go. We build a life together that honors both our worlds. And we let Matteo plan the wedding, since he's clearly the expert on romance in this family. Can we have dinosaur decorations?" Matteo asked immediately. "We can have whatever you want," Dan said, squeezing his son's hand as they made their way through the terminal. Past the people who'd witnessed their impromptu engagement, Dan realized that his son had been right all along. Sometimes love really was as simple as seeing what someone needed and having the courage to offer it. Sometimes the most important connections happened when you least expected them. And sometimes a 9-year-old's innocent question could change everything. The ring on Lila's finger caught the light as she held both their hands. And Dan thought it looked exactly right, not because it was expensive or impressive, but because it represented a choice they'd all made together. The choice to believe that love could overcome any obstacle, bridge any gap, and create families in the most unexpected ways. They were going home. 6 months later, the same community center that had hosted the fair, where everything began, was decorated with an eclectic mixture of elegant white flowers and inflatable dinosaurs, a combination that perfectly represented the blending of two very different worlds into something entirely new and wonderful. "I still can't believe you let him put velociraptors on the altar," Maria whispered to Dan as they watched Mateo carefully arrange the ring pillow for the 3rd time, his face serious with the importance of his role as ring bearer and chief wedding coordinator. "He negotiated hard for those dinosaurs," Dan replied, adjusting his tie nervously. "Besides, Lila loves them almost as much as he does." The guest list was an interesting study in contrast. Neighbors from Sunrise Gardens sitting beside tech executives, Mrs. Rodriguez holding court with former CEOs, and Mateo's entire 3rd grade class occupying the front row with the solemnity of people witnessing history in the making. 5 minutes, Mr. Morales," announced the wedding coordinator, a patient woman who'd somehow managed to blend Lila's sophisticated vision with Mateo's prehistoric enthusiasm and Dan's desire for something simple and authentic. Dan took a deep breath, looking out at the gathered crowd of people who'd become their extended family over the past months. The transition hadn't always been smooth learning to navigate Lila's business commitments, figuring out how to maintain their family values while accepting her generous spirit, finding the balance between Dan's fierce independence and Lila's natural inclination to solve problems with resources. But they'd figured it out together, one conversation at a time, one compromise at a time, one ordinary moment at a time. "Dad," Mateo appeared at his elbow, practically vibrating with excitement. "Lila looks amazing. And guess what? Dr. Martinez came. The real Dr. Martinez. She said she wouldn't miss the wedding of her favorite young paleontologist." Dan smiled at his. Son's joy. Lila had quietly arranged for several of Mateo's scientific heroes to attend, turning their wedding into an impromptu educational conference that had Matteo convinced this was the best day in the history of the world. The music began not traditional wedding marches, but a song Matteo had chosen because it sounded like family. And Dan took his place at the altar between an elegant floral arrangement and a remarkably accurate triceratops. When Lila appeared at the back of the room, Dan's breath caught as it had every day for the past 6 months. She was beautiful, but more than that, she looked happy, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or perfect makeup and everything to do with the simple pleasure of marrying the people she loved. She'd chosen a dress that was elegant, but not ostentatious, flowers that were beautiful, but not extravagant, a ceremony that honored both her sophistication and their family's down-to-earth values. She walked down the aisle alone, by choice, having said that she'd already found her family and didn't need anyone to give her away. Matteo met her halfway, offering his arm with the gallantry of a 9-year-old who'd been practicing his escort duties for weeks. Together, they walked toward Dan, and he realized this was exactly what he'd hoped for, not a wedding where Lila was joining their family, or where he and Matteo were joining hers, but a ceremony where they were all choosing each other, officially and forever. Dearly beloved, began Pastor Williams, who'd agreed to officiate despite admitting he'd never performed a ceremony that included paleontological decorations. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Daniel, Lila, and Matteo as they become a family in the eyes of God and this community. The ceremony was a blend of traditional vows and personal promises. Don promised to trust Lila's generous heart even when it challenged his pride. Lila promised to respect Dan's independence even as she offered her support. Together, they promised Matteo that his happiness and security would always be their first priority. But the moment that brought tears to every eye in the room came when Matteo stepped forward with his own prepared statement. "I want to say something too," he announced, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "When I asked Lila to marry my dad at the fair, I thought I was just trying to find him a girlfriend so he wouldn't be lonely. But I learned that family isn't just about not being lonely. It's about finding people who make you want to be your best self and who love you even when you're not." He paused, looking back and forth between Dan and Lila with the seriousness of someone making a profound observation. "Lila makes my dad smile more, and my dad makes Lila laugh at his jokes even when they're not funny. They both make me feel safe and loved and like I can be anything I want to be. So I'm not just getting a new mom today, we're all getting a new family." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Matteo carefully placed his hand on top of Dan and Lila's joined hands. "I pronounce you husband and wife and family," Pastor Williams said with a smile. "Dan, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender and full of promise, but it was interrupted by Matteo's enthusiastic cheer and the eruption of applause from their assembled friends and family. The reception was held in the same community center, transformed by Lila's event planning skills and Mrs. Rodriguez's fierce determination to feed everyone properly. The head table included not just the bride and groom, but Matteo as well, officially recognized as an equal partner in this new family arrangement. "Speech, speech," called out Carlos from the contractor's table, and soon the entire room was chanting. For words from the happy couple, Dan stood first, his hand finding Lila's automatically. "6 months ago, I thought I had my life figured out. I was a single dad doing my best to raise an amazing kid, and I thought that was enough. I thought wanting more was selfish or dangerous or asking for trouble." He paused, looking down at Matteo, who was beaming with pride. "Then my son decided to play matchmaker, and I learned that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes love finds you in a community center parking lot, And sometimes family happens when a billionaire decides your kid is worth reading bedtime stories to. Laughter rippled through the crowd as Lila squeezed his hand. But mostly I learned that love isn't about finding someone who fits perfectly into your existing life. It's about finding someone worth building a new life with. Someone who makes you brave enough to become the person you were meant to be. He turned to Lila, his voice growing softer. Thank you for seeing us, really seeing us, and deciding we were worth loving. Thank you for letting a 9-year-old's innocent question change all our lives for the better. Lila stood beside him, her own eyes bright with tears. I've given a lot of speeches in boardrooms and conference halls, she began, but I've never had anything more important to say than this. Thank you for teaching me what home feels like. She looked out at the crowd, at the mixture of her former colleagues and their neighborhood friends, at the life they'd built together that was richer and more meaningful than anything she'd achieved in business. I spent years building a company and accumulating success, thinking that was what mattered. But it took a little boy asking me to marry his father to realize that the most important thing you can build is a family. The most valuable thing you can accumulate is love. She knelt down to Matteo's level, speaking directly to him. And you, my brilliant boy, taught me that sometimes the most important questions are the ones that seem impossible to answer. Thank you for being brave enough to ask. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Dan found himself on the small dance floor with his wife and son, swaying to music that Matteo had insisted represented family happiness. Lila had her arms around both of them, and Dan marveled at how perfectly they fit together. So what happens now? Matteo asked, echoing the question that had started their journey together. Now we go home, Lila said, the same answer she'd given at the airport, but with even more meaning, all of us together. To our house? Matteo asked. They'd spent months house hunting, looking for a place that would feel like home to all three. Of them big enough for Lila's work needs, but grounded enough to honor Dan's values. Fancy enough to accommodate the occasional business dinner, but comfortable enough for homework at the kitchen table. To our home, Dan corrected. The one we chose together. Later that night, after the last guest had left, and the dinosaurs had been carefully packed away for future family celebrations, the three of them sat in their new living room, sharing wedding cake and rehashing the day's highlights. Matteo had finally crashed from the excitement, falling asleep between his parents on the couch with frosting still on his cheek. No regrets? Dan asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's face. Only that it took us 6 weeks to figure out what Matteo knew in 6 seconds, Lila replied, settling more comfortably against his shoulder. Dan looked around their new home, compromise between Lila's sophisticated tastes and his practical needs, filled with expensive art and handmade family photos, professional-grade kitchen equipment, and Matteo's rock collection prominently displayed. It was exactly what they'd all needed, a place that honored where they'd come from while embracing where they were going. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For being brave enough to let a stranger's kid ask you an impossible question. For being patient enough to let me figure out that I deserve an answer. For loving us enough to build a whole new life. Thank you for raising a son wise enough to see what we both needed, Lila replied. And for being mad enough to chase me through an airport with a poster board and a ring. They sat in comfortable silence, holding each other and their sleeping son, surrounded by the evidence of their blended life. Wedding photos would be added to Matteo's family tree project, continuing the story that had started with a simple school assignment and would now span generations. In the morning, they'd wake up as a family officially, legally, completely. They'd make breakfast together, help Matteo with homework, navigate the ordinary challenges of merging two very different lives into one shared future. They'd figure out how to balance business meetings with soccer practice, charity galas with family movie nights. The demands of success with the simple pleasure of being together. But tonight, they were simply three people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, proving that sometimes the most important connections happen when you least expect them. And that love really can bridge any gap, even the one between a handyman and a billionaire, who both needed to remember what home felt like. Outside their new house, Mrs. Rodriguez drove slowly past their lit windows, smiled with satisfaction at the sight of their little family, and began planning her next matchmaking project. After all, Mateo's teacher was still single, and Mrs. Rodriguez was nothing if not thorough when it came to matters of the heart. Some stories end with happily ever after, but the best ones end with happily ever beginning, and this was definitely one of the best ones.